I'm Imu Shalev, and this is A Book Like No Other. If you boil our last 5 episodes down, here's what you get. If you want to relate to God's words, first, embrace them as a tree of life. Then, serve them as a tree of knowledge. We've unpacked that idea through the story of Gan Eden, the burning bush, Sinai, and finally entering the land of Israel. But I'm guessing something still feels off. I know I had 2 major questions left. First, I just couldn't fully wrap my head around the trippy, shape-shifting nature of the tree. It's in the garden, it's in the desert, now it's in the land of Israel. How does it keep moving through space and time? But here's the second question. More than these shifts in location, I was really struggling with the shift in medium. First, God gives us a tree. Then we get a text, the Torah. It's a beautiful metaphor, but is that all the tree is? A fancy metaphor for Torah? In the world of the text, it doesn't seem to be. The tree is presented as an actual tree. That's what's in the garden, a green, fruit-laden tree. It's only centuries later that the Torah shows up. And what if Adam and Eve hadn't jumped to eat the fruit and we'd stayed in Eden? Would they have been given the Torah text at all? So how do we understand the tree on its own terms? Or is asking that still taking this whole thing too literally? Was the tree really always the Torah? The Torah somehow always the tree? So let's start with question 1, how the tree shifts in location. To address that one, I actually want to jump back into our last episode. There was a little more to that conversation than we shared in this podcast, and I want to play some of that for you now that directly answers this question. Let me set up the tape for you. Right at the end of last episode, Rabbi Fohrman had been arguing that the tree of knowledge returns when we get to the land of Israel. And now he was showing how there's even a revelation moment at Jericho that parallels what happened at Mount Sinai. Or rather, what might have happened at Mount Sinai if we'd accepted God's invitation to go up the mountain.
Remember we talked about how we were supposed to go up the mountain? The moment we were supposed to go up the mountain was when there was a shofar blast, the blast of the Yovel.
Yes.
It turns out that there's another shofar blast. If you just read a little bit more, and you'll see it. Famously, we go around the Jericho 7 times, right?
Yeah.
And then take a look at verse 5.
V'haya bimshoch bekeren hayovel. It shall be in the blowing of the horn of Jubilee of the Yovel. Kishamachem et kol hashofar. When you hear the voice of the shofar, yariu kol ha'am teruah gdola. Right? All the people shall make a great cry. V'nafla chomat ha'ir, and the walls of the city shall fall tachtel. Ve'alu ha'am ish negdo, and the people should go up. Right? So just like at Sinai, where there's bimshoch hayovel hema ya'alu bahar, here there's a bimshoch hayovel. People are going to alu on the city, which is crazy,
isn't it?
Because that seems to say that, right, the mountain of God, which we're saying is Eden, is now going to become Jericho.
Exactly.
Somehow, right? That's what the algebra suggests. That, right, when you blow the horn, then the people can ascend the mountain of God. So here, when you blow the horn, you can ascend to the city.
Yep. It's almost like when with the falling of those walls, it's like you're getting this elevator transport up to the top of the city, right? Because it's like at the top of the walls now, you go up.
Fascinating.
Right? And somehow we're hearing these resonances, and it's as if there's another revelation of the Torah. It's the revelation of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It's the revelation of the practical side of Torah.
It's actually just to add a piece here, I wonder whether you think this is relevant. There's a methodological tool you once taught me, which is mechanism, right? What is the mechanism by which something happens? So, for instance, what is the mechanism by which the walls fall down? Or what is the mechanism by which the city becomes the Garden of Eden? And I wonder, right, if you look here in the verses, the real leader of the 7 circuits around Jericho is the Ark of God. And right in the Ark are those 10 commandments. It has Kruvim on that Ark. I'm harping on the 10 commandments because that's the physical object we get at Mount Sinai. It's the physical manifestation we have of God's words. So again, following the algebra, it's the object which comes to replace or represent the tree during Revelation 2.0. So it's almost like there's this transition moment. Like at one moment, Jericho's not the mountain of God. Jericho's not Eden. And when the ark goes around it 7 times, it's looking for a new home. And all of a sudden it becomes Eden. And maybe that's sort of like the beginning of the conquest of Israel, is sort of the new transplanting of the tree.
That's a beautiful way of thinking about it. The transplanting of the tree. What an interesting way to think of the Mishkan, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's that the tree has been in like a nomad, but now it's got some ground for it to be planted in.
You can put roots.
You can start serving it again. It can be more than a bush.
It's actually crazy, because if you're right about this, how do we know where Eden is? The answer is it's wherever the tree is. And then now in the 21st century, right, where the tree has evolved back into Torah, right? Maybe we build Eden. I don't know. I'm like speculating here, but the implication of this is really remarkable.
Yeah, it sounds like Eden goes where the tree goes, and that when you build that, once the tree is there, the garden reassembles itself.
Eden goes where the tree goes. That's pretty cool. But Rabbi Fohrman was about to take this idea one step further. What if it even applies to the very first Eden?
By the way, remember how we talked about the garden, about the tree of life being in the middle of the garden? How it was the one pre-existing tree? All the other trees got planted, but this was a tree that was just there.
Rabbi Fohrman's referring back to Genesis 2:9. Remember that verse begins by describing the other trees in the garden? Vayatzmach Hashem Elokim min ha'adama kol eitz. And God caused to grow from the ground every tree. Then we get introduced to the tree of life, and all we are told is ve'etz ha'chaim betoch hagan. The tree of life was in the middle of the garden. No growing, no from the ground. It was just there.
Maybe the reason why it's the central tree is because if there's one tree that's first, all the other trees by definition grow up around it.
Mm-hmm.
That means that even the first garden was a garden because the tree was there.
It was a transplant.
Yeah, it's like a transplant came from heaven. And isn't it interesting that almost you have a revelation story there? The tree was pre-existing because it came from heaven. And then at Sinai, what do you have? The tree, again, it's coming from heaven, right? You have the God's word coming from heaven. Moses goes up, brings it down, right? It goes on a journey, gets transplanted into the ground again. And then there's all this vegetation that grows up around, and man is called upon to serve and to work the land again. And it's like, we're back.
Crazy. This is mind-blowing. Beautiful stuff.
Which means really that the end of the Torah really does mirror its beginning. That as we're on the cusp of coming into the land,
New Eden,
all this stuff is saying it's a new Eden.
Naming the tree as a transplant was the first time I felt I really had a coherent understanding of what we'd been saying. The tree wasn't just magically popping up in different places. That was its nature from the very beginning. It's kind of like in Great Expectations when you find out that Pip's benefactor is the criminal he helped way back in the beginning of the novel, and suddenly the whole story fits together. Sorry, spoiler alert, but Great Expectations has really been out for a while. Anyway, I felt like I had the full picture of the tree now, how it connects us to God and how that connection can occur across space and time. But even more importantly, calling the tree a transplant made the connection between the tree and Torah click. It's nice thinking of Torah as a big, rooted oak, but it's a stretch of the imagination. Torah, on a simple visual level, isn't very tree-like, but the minute we describe the tree as a transplant, I could see the Torah that way. From the tablets within the Ark to modern Torah scrolls, it really wasn't a stretch of the imagination to imagine them as scraggly, uprooted trees in need of planting and tending. And of course, the image is doubly inspiring when you add that by tending to these trees, we're growing Eden around us. So like I said, at this point, I thought I had a coherent picture of the tree and even thought I had a grasp on the relationship between the Torah and the tree. They were really one and the same, down to the details. Both were forms of revelation. Both were sources of God's breath. Remember, Rabbi Fohrman suggested that God's breath was like the oxygen the tree released, and the Torah was originally revealed by God's kol, his voice, which is essentially modified breath. Both the tree and the Torah were also sources of knowledge, and both were primordial transplants. Whether you want to call the tree an early prototype of Torah, or you want to see it as a metaphor, there was a perfect, elegant, one-to-one correspondence between the Torah and the tree. Now, I know I'm hitting you over the head with this, but it's because Rabbi Fohrman's about to call it out as the great flaw of his whole theory. So let me set up this next conversation for you. Rabbi Fohrman and I had just finished our learning. It had been eye-opening and life-changing, and not quite satisfying. For everything I just said about having a coherent picture of the tree and its relationship to Torah, I still had the second big question I opened this episode with. Especially if the Torah and the tree were so similar, essentially one and the same, why not reveal the Torah in the garden? Was the tree just an elaborate metaphor for Torah, or was there something more going on? But hey, lingering questions are all part of learning, and we just moved on to other projects. Until, weeks later, we had an editorial meeting for this very podcast. Suddenly, we were rehashing and re-examining everything we'd done. And, almost as if we'd picked up right where we left off, I noticed something that once again had to do with the tree. Just seeming to be there, pre-existing in the garden.
I need to say something that's been at the tip of my tongue. I don't know whether you find this resonant. I just need to get it off my chest. The tree here is b'toch hagan. It's sort of pre-exists the world.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if perhaps if we're right that the coal and the tree are sort of synonymous, that if coal pre-exists the world in some way.
Yes.
And I thought to myself, wouldn't it be interesting if there was evidence of that?
By coal, I mean God's voice. Remember, at Sinai, before God's words are carved into the tablets, revelation occurs through this voice. So when we say Torah is synonymous with the tree, we mean the text, the tablets, but we also mean this voice. And that's why I was wondering if this coal was primordial, just like the tree. But before I could offer my evidence for this, Rabbi Fohrman was already thinking of some. This famous verse. Vayomer Elokim yihi or vayhi or. God said, let there be light, and there was light. This verse tells us that God created the universe through speech. Speaking implies a voice, a connection Rabbi Fohrman quickly made.
Interesting. In other words, what you're saying is that the world comes into formation with words, but the pre-existing thing before that is coal. That's very interesting. It's very deep and beautiful, because what it leads to is the idea that just as for God, there was a pre-existing coal which had no utility, it just was, because it needed to be. And then God decided to make something of the coal and formed it into words. That gets redone at Sinai when we hear the call of the shofar, which has no meaning other than it just needs to be there, but then becomes words in the Aseres Adibros, right? Just as the world was created that way. Fascinating.
So there might even be more. I was just looking at Genesis 1 and seeing if there's even more evidence for that.
I was looking at the very first verses of Genesis 1, where we get a short description of things pre-creation.
You have va'aretz etato vavohu v'choshech al pnei tehom. What else is there? There's ruach Elokim mirachefet al pnei hamayim.
The earth was unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep and the wind of God hovering over the water.
So if I take you there to that world, and you can't really see anything because it's dark, but if you're listening to something, what do you hear?
The sound of the ruach.
Right. It sounds almost like a howl, right? Like howling wind.
Or the sound that ruach makes. And what is the call of the shofar other than the sound that ruach makes?
It's almost primordial coal. It's wind before it gets focused through a shofar or through, larynx, whatever it is.
Before it gets focused through a voice box. It's
Exactly.
What coal really is just ruach. And what's also fascinating is the ruach Elokim also pre-exists creation in the world along with the water. So there it is, the coal.
Exactly.
The coal along with the water.
Of course, it's not radical to say God's voice pre-existed us all, but it was cool to see another one of those correspondences between Torah and the tree hinted to in the text. Hinted is right. Is that what you're thinking? It's a bit of a leap from ruach to coal? Hold on, there's more.
Now that you know that, come with me to Genesis 3.
Okay, yeah.
Genesis 3:8 to be exact. This is right after Adam and Eve ate the fruit and were told that they hear God's coal walking in the garden, which is the first time the word coal is used in the entire Torah. But there's also another word in this verse that I wanted Rabbi Fohrman to notice.
Do you remember where coal shows up?
Yeah, kol Hashem Elokim yitalech b'gan l'ruach hayom.
Say that again in your head. What do you make of that?
Oh, L'Ruach Hayam, that's what you're pointing at?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's interesting.
In Genesis 3:8, Adam and Eve hid because they hear the sound of God moving about in the garden at Ruach Hayom, which for now will translate as the breezy time of day. It's the very first kol, and we have Ruach there too. Only here it's Ruach Hayom, the Ruach of days, not Ruach Elokim like in Genesis chapter 1. So the connection was growing stronger. Now the trouble was, what do we make of it?
I don't know what to make of it, but I do find it.
Here's an interesting, pretty psychedelic way of thinking about it. But let's play this little game. If Ruach is pre-existing and goes all the way back to creation, as you're suggesting, where does Yom take you back in creation?
There's the sun, moon, and stars, Liamim.
No, Yom, the first day, the days of creation. And when was there Ruach Elokim in terms of the days?
Before
the days. So, what does Ruach Hayom mean?
Pre-existing.
No. The original Ruach, you just told me, was before days.
Mm-hmm.
Which means that Ruach Hayom is which kind of Ruach?
After the days?
Ruach after days. In other words, the original Ruach, as you're suggesting, is the primordial Ruach that was always there. God's own primordial Ruach. What Ruach is this, the Ruach Hayom? It's a version of that within creation. There's a version of that in pre-creation and a version of it in creation. The version of it in pre-creation is so primordial that it's the stuff out of which the Big Bang itself emerges, right? That doesn't exist in creation. If it did, it would destroy the world in another explosion, right? But a version of it exists.
Rabbi Fohrman was suggesting that the Ruach Hayom is like a domesticated, this-world version of the primordial Ruach Elokim. A fascinating idea, but for Rabbi Fohrman, it also became a reason to reevaluate everything we'd been saying in this podcast.
If you think about it, Imu, and this is something which I was struggling this morning, I listened through the first episode, and in reflecting on it with the benefit of hindsight after many months, I think there's a subtle flaw in the theory that we suggested throughout this whole thing. And the flaw is this. Once you start saying there's one tree, and what's the tree? It's Torah, right? And the Torah is God's voice. You now have a problem, which is, why are these trees back in Eden? Are you telling me the Torah is back in Eden? Right? So, and if you're telling me that, so what are you telling me? That it's some sort of symbol of God's voice? So let it just be God's voice. Like, I don't quite get it. You're telling me God's commands are the trees? So what is this? What were the trees originally? I get it that later on the trees are identified as Torah, but that's later on. That's not in the beginning. You're being anachronistic when you take Psalm 30 from the end of the Torah and reading it all the way back in the beginning and saying, oh, it's Torah, right? The trees are Torah. But if the trees aren't Torah, what are they, and what do I make of that connection? I think the issues which we're touching on now help us focus on this. The answers are quite mysterious, and I don't know quite how to put them in words, but all I'll say for now is this. There are iterations. What are trees? It goes back to what we said earlier. A tree is something which nurtures you, which comes from the world of the Creator into your world. So there's trees that come from the ground, comes into the man's world and modulates nutrition. And there's trees that come from the sky, the tree of life, and modulates nutrition from the sky. Now, what I want to suggest is that in the beginning, that wasn't the Torah. Those were actually trees. In other words, there was something weird, which is that the way we were going to understand knowledge of good and evil was not the way we understand it now. That's an iteration 2 that we have a Torah, and there's a voice that comes to our ears, and we modulate that with our brain, and we start to cognize good and evil. What the Torah is saying is that in Plan A, originally, there was a different route to that nutrition. There were these trees, and if you ate from the tree, that's how you got good and evil. It's almost like, in a weird kind of way, in as much as Eden can mean not yet, from the word Adayin, it evokes the womb, right? There's something womb-like about Eden. Well, in the womb, how does a kid get his nutrition?
Umbilical cord.
And it's so weird to us because we get nutrition by eating, right? We can't imagine getting nutrition any other way other than eating, but a child does. How does a child get oxygen?
Umbilical cord.
We can't imagine getting oxygen through an umbilical cord. We can only imagine breathing with our mouth, right? So in Eden, in this womb-like existence, there was a different way you got your nutrition. You didn't get your nutrition from God the way you get it in a post-Eden world, through your ears and through your brain. You get your nutrition through an umbilical cord, through trees. And there's this tree that modulates divine energy, and if you eat from it, that's how you come to your understanding of good and evil, completely bypassing your brain. And there's this tree of life and of energy that is a tree that gives you connection to God. What happens is the minute that we spurn the trees, God immediately goes into a second iteration, and that, I think, is God's voice. God says, okay, fine. Here's another way that I come into your world, and another way that you can relate to me. Forget the trees. Here's my voice. What do you think of my voice? It's almost like God's trying to recapture the original way that we were supposed to relate to the tree of life, which is just enjoy it, right? Can you just enjoy my voice? Can you just go strolling with me, right? Could we do that maybe? And what is this voice? It is a version of something primordial still, and that is the original voice that God uses to create the world, a version of which is these trees, right? But when those trees go, there's another voice. What kind of voice? A voice l'ruach hayom. It's not a shattering voice that would catalyze the Big Bang and bring into the world creation itself once those become words. It's a version of that voice. It's a pale shadow of that voice. It's a voice that exists within the created world. Because think about it, the whole notion of hearing God's voice in this world is crazy. God's voice from beyond space and time is going to come into this world. It's a version of God's voice, tailor-made for creation. But it was God's attempt to say, let's do it over. Here's another chance at Ruach. Could you hang out with me? And then when we spurned that and said, no, we're really not interested in that, right? God was like, okay, this really isn't going to end well. This whole thing has got to change. And we get kicked out of the garden. And in a way, we remain starved of God's voice, and things don't go well. That humanity corrupts itself and is destroyed time after time. At first in a flood, and then in Migdal Bavel. And what you have with Avram is the reconstruction of God's voice in the world, which with what eventually becomes the Torah, and finally we can breathe again.
Beautiful.
Here's what I heard Rabbi Fohrman saying. The question isn't whether the tree is the Torah or the Torah is the tree. Both the tree and the Torah, God's voice in all of its forms, are iterations of something much, much bigger and far more primordial, the original Ruach of God. At different times, this Ruach manifests differently.
The voice of God appears in ways that is appropriate for the environment in which it appears. When the environment changes, the nature of the kol has to change.
To really break this down, Rabbi Fohrman was identifying 4 iterations or stages to how God manifested himself.
So, stage 1 is pre-creation. The Ruach Elokim, the pre-existing voice that exists before the world is created. Everything becomes just a version of that. So in pre-creation, you have the least adulterated form of it. So you have the voice, even before words.
Stage 2 is the trees.
Once you have a world and you have a garden, so the voice takes on the form of an iteration that works for the garden. And that iteration is the trees. And the closest analogy for that is it's an umbilical cord from mother to child.
On to stage 3, Ruach Hayom.
Then as we spurn one of those umbilical cords, right, the tree of life, and we reach for another, God says, scratch the umbilical cords. Let me create a third iteration of this thing, a version of my voice that can work within the world. And that is the kol elokim that's mitalech bagan l'ruach hayom, right? A kol that is a kind of version of the Ruach, but is a Ruach Hayom version of it.
But we hide from the Ruach Hayom. We don't exactly embrace it. So, enter stage 4.
Which is, okay, I'm going to have to show up again with my voice, and we're going to have to write it down, and people are going to have to be able to listen to that voice in ways that approximate what they were supposed to do back in the garden. And the revelation of the Torah is a further fourth version of this voice.
Can I just tell you what this makes me think of?
Isn't it interesting that like something that was like an organic tree is then taught to us as like a book with laws? Like it's very static. And think about where we put that book with laws. We put it in a box which has 2 kruvim etched into it. Right? They're made and formed out of metal. But originally, the tree was in a garden with real life kruvim who with fiery swords and wings, they were alive. So like there's something beautiful about getting the Torah and putting it in this golden box, but in its original form, the temple that we have wasn't static, rock, stone, metal. It was alive. It was a garden with trees.
And it seems like when man becomes a knower of good and evil, when man's da'as comes alive, it's almost like he can't hear the ruach of the trees, or he can't absorb the Torah of the trees. Instead, God uses ruach now to speak to man's mind. It's sort of like man's mind needs to hear the ruach. And strangely, the vehicle for that is voice and words.
Right. It's fascinating. I think what you're saying is that there was a point in man's history where man began to prioritize his brain and use it to shape the world. And once man becomes a brain-heavy being that defines himself through his brain to make things and do things in the world, God's forced to relate to him that way and says, okay, that's the way you need my voice, relating to your brain. Okay, so here's a Torah that relates to your brain. But don't get too focused on the brain part of Torah. There's something in there that's pre-brain that you still need to relate to in those words. And you're going to get that even when you think all you're doing is brain stuff. You don't realize you're being nourished by something inside those words, which you can't really parse with your brain. It's just the connection with me. And I'm going to give you that being thing despite yourself, even if I have to feed it to you through your brain. But the natural way to feed it to you would be in your totally being state of just taking it as an umbilical cord. The same way that you would sort of by osmosis eventually come to know good and evil in a non-cognitive way, but just an intuitive way as a function of the umbilical cord influencing your being. And then once we really develop that cognitive part, it's like, okay, fine, I have to teach it to you. So here's this Torah, but don't forget about the voice that underlies it.
If God's telling you to read the Torah, what's the verb that's used for read?
Likro.
Good. What does that word mean?
To call. Oh, very interesting.
Right? It's almost as if the Torah is telling you when you read, you're supposed to read it out loud. Right? Like if you read with your mind, maybe you're depriving yourself.
Or perhaps to read is to respond to a call.
Yeah.
When you read, you're not just reading, right? The author is calling to you in the words.
What the Torah is emphasizing is not the mentality of reading. It's not just like the thing that's going on in your brain. It's actually the listening to the voice. Right? It's funny, in English you don't have it, but in Hebrew, the word to read and the word to call is the same, as if your reading is reading it out loud.
Or to respond to the voice that's coming to you in the words with your own voice when you read. Almost as if in the act of reading you're engaging in conversation.
I don't know if you can hear in my voice or Rabbi Fohrman's how revelatory this conversation felt to us. Here's why. Up until now, everything we saw kept pointing to a kind of fundamental tension between being and doing, between Yud-Keh Vav-Keh and Elohim. And we'd seen how that tension plays out in the tree, between the tree itself and its fruit, and how it plays out in the Torah, between listening to God's voice versus following his commands. But now we were seeing that the Torah and the trees were not just 2 different expressions of the very same thing. There are significant differences between them. It seems like the tree, as a total iteration, both the tree of life side and tree of knowledge side, is all a little more, tree of life-y, more a pure being way to soak up God's nourishment. And the Torah text as a whole is more tree of knowledge-y, more cognitive. So the iterations themselves, as whole units, they exist on this range between doing and being. That's wild. And here's why I think so. I think a lot of us treat thinking as our highest purpose. And we defend that by pointing to Torah. Look, God wants us to study this book. Study is what it's all about, and I'm not knocking that. But the Torah, maybe in some small way, might be. It's like it's saying about itself, hey, I'm not the ideal form. I'm the consolation prize. Halavai, you still had that tree. Maybe transcendence is found when you come back down to earth, in your intuitions and voice, not just your thoughts. But was this really what the Torah was saying? Or were we letting our speculation get the best of us? So, actually, Rabbi Fohrman and I weren't the only ones on this call. Our editor was there too, and what we were saying reminded her of something strange in the verses. Remember when God first describes the tree, he calls them Nechmad limar'eh v'tov l'ma'achal, pleasant to behold and good to eat? And then when Eve describes the tree, she seems to flip and pervert that description. V'teireh ha'isha ki tov ha'etz l'ma'achal, v'chi ta'avahu la'inayim. The woman saw that the tree was good to eat and desirable for the eyes. Well, Eve also adds a third descriptor that doesn't have a parallel in chapter 2. V'nechmad ha'etz lehaskil, that the tree was desirable as a source of wisdom or thought. Isn't it interesting that Eve is the one who identifies and calls out the way the tree may feed the intellect? It seemed to support the trend from being to cognition that we'd been seeing.
That is interesting. That's fascinating, actually.
Yeah,
Notice
cool.
that she's the one who comes up with Nechmad Eitz Laskil, almost as if in that moment she's prioritizing her brain and saying, I just don't want the umbilical cord anymore. I can't have it that way. This tree tickles my brain. I want to relate to it that way. And God says, okay, we don't have to do the tree anymore. I can just talk to you. If you understand the implications of that, what it means is it was Chava who really decided to see it that way. And in seeing that way, it was the beginning, just seeing it that way was the beginning of the rejection of the tree as tree. I can't take the tree. I need to relate to it with mind.
The moment you begin to contemplate the tree, you've stopped seeing it. You've turned it into an idea rather than appreciating it for what it is.
It's almost as if the mind, in some crazy way, muddles the clarity of Tov and Ra, right? Because it's almost like a secondary way that human beings can apprehend it, but not primary. The primary way is through this umbilical cord, through trees, and we just can't understand what that means because we're not in the womb anymore. The same way that we can logically see that there's this umbilical cord that the child gets from and it works, but we have no intuitive understanding anymore.
Rabbi Fohrman was painting a stark division between the tree iteration and the iteration that we experience, Torah. A division that I wasn't fully comfortable with.
This may be radical, but I'm not sure I agree that it's as stark and as understandable as you're saying in terms of the umbilical cord analogy, although I love the analogy. I do think that this style of Torah learning has taught me that maybe this second iteration nudges you back to the first iteration.
Oh, sure it does. No, it definitely does. In other words, the whole idea that there is voice to be found in the words is telling you, is helping you recapture a little bit, helping you see past the illusion that the brain is the only way that you can get this, and saying there's something unbrain-like about this. There's a mode of connecting, but the deepest way of connecting would have been even not to listen with your ears, but just to experience with your eyes this tree. Yeah.
I forgot exactly where it was, but I think we saw like coming into the land, that which was stilted and static becomes organic again. The Torah's mitzvot force you back into an organic and symbiotic relationship with nature itself. Strangely, like when you keep the commands and you live in your just ways, then the world becomes alive for you again, right? The rain falls in its right time, and then the justice sprouts from the earth, and so does food. The mitzvot themselves really do agriculturally like force you into symbiotic relationships with land and plants, like the chametz stuff and shemitah stuff and yovel kilayim and shatnez. Like they're all versions, I think, of this idea.
Our meeting was over and we had to run, but the final thought stayed with me. When the tree fails, we go from a more organic iteration to a more cognitive one, Torah. And in some ways, that's like the umbilical cord being cut. There's no going back. But maybe it's not so final. For one, God's voice is still there in the words, nudging you back toward the tree of life. And even if you miss that, even if you're such a diehard tree of knowledge person that the bottom line, practical commandments are the only way you connect, the mitzvahs themselves will nudge you back. In its fully actualized form, the Torah is deeply intertwined with agriculture. Shemitah, Yovel, Kilayim, these are all mitzvahs that have to do with our relationship to farming and not over-processing the land. They compel us to recognize our symbiotic relationship with the earth. And so, in some way through them, Torah itself fosters a more organic way of being and brings us closer to that earlier iteration found in the garden. It's like the Torah interjects itself into nature. You can't get away from it. Torah is actualized through our relationship with produce, harvests, and trees. It's almost like the Torah evolves back into organic material, back into the tree. After this conversation, that was the image in my mind. The Torah evolving back into the tree, and the space around the tree evolving back into Eden. Eden, where the two trees were one, and where maybe, not to be too idealistic, the cognitive and intuitive parts of ourselves could find some unity too. It reminded me of the transplant idea from earlier, only now, the figurative and the literal meaning of that were merging. In a very visceral way, Torah is uprooted, and it's our job to replant it. You know, way back in that earlier recording, when we first discussed the transplant idea, Rabbi Fohrman actually had a little more to say on it. The idea of transplanting the tree sparked a connection for him with a seemingly unrelated verse in Exodus chapter 15, verse 17, which is a line from the song the Israelites sing after being saved at the Red Sea. I want to play that for you now. I've been saving this bit because I think when you hear it through the lens of everything we've come to, it's going to mean that much more.
Isn't it fascinating that if you look at the Shirat Hayam, which is the song at the sea, and you actually parse the poetry, you have this really interesting moment. Read verse 17 and 18.
Yeah, verse 17 and 18 have bothered me for many years. Tiviemu v'tita'emu bahar nachalatcha. You'll bring them and plant them.
Plant them.
Cool.
Bahar nachalatcha.
And the mountain of your inheritance.
And the mountain of your inheritance. Think about what that means.
To me, this always felt like some later editor stuck this in because we didn't learn about this yet. There's no har nachalatcha. There's no mountain of your inheritance. They're not in the land yet. Machon l'shiftecha pa'alta, right? You're going to establish some dwelling place for you, God. He doesn't talk about that yet, right? Mikdash Adonai kananu yadecha, a mikdash, a Beit HaMikdash, right? A sanctuary your hands will establish for yourself.
And now we understand what this verse means. This is the mission statement, right? This journey is we're going somewhere. We're going to bring you, but not just to bring you, vitita.
Yeah, there's that word.
We're bringing you.
To plant.
To be planted.
That word was back in Genesis 2, when God planted the
That's
garden.
Right. To all the trees. This is a transplanting mission for the tree of knowledge and the tree of life. Where are you going to plant it, Imu? Bahar nachalatcha. Where was that neglected garden? What did it look like, that neglected garden that was only watched over and wasn't worked?
It was the garden on the barren mountain.
The barren mountain of Har Chorev, right? By the way, Chorev can also mean Charev, which means barren.
Right.
Right, in 1948, you came to the land, it wasn't so pretty.
Right.
Well, you came into the land there and it wasn't so pretty in a spiritual way. It was just a little bush. It wasn't taken care of. All it was is a barren mountain, but it was the barren mountain of God's inheritance. An inheritance is what? Something that comes to you from another world. Well, God's word comes to you from another world. God didn't die, but he lives in another world, and he gave it to you in this world. So we got inherited.
It's actually, that word is quite powerful. It evokes almost like seed, like when you give someone seed capital. right? Like
Hmm.
so that they can then plant
Yeah.
it and make something of it. Like here, it's very literal.
Yep.
It's right. It's the seedling.
Yep. Exactly. But as it is with any inheritance, take this little thing and see what you can make of it. You're carrying the torch in a new generation. What are you going to make of this?
You can allow it to flourish, or is it going to shrivel into a bush?
Yeah. And that's the challenge. Here's this inheritance. Can you plant it? Can you make it more than a mountain? Can you make it a garden? It's all about the vision is there to be finally this place where it can rest. And when it can rest, the
Right.
transplanting of Tita Emu to be planted is complete. Then you know that you've been planted. That what you've really done in Israel is you've made a place for yourself, which it's up to us to build. And if we can build it, then we've transplanted the tree. We've built a new Eden, which is the whole point of the Torah, to somehow the man who was banished from the last garden and the garden has shriveled because he wasn't there to be oved, has to fix that, has to come into the garden and retransplant that tree.
Amazing. Beautiful.
I like to joke with Rabbi Fohrman that the plants in my house increased tenfold since we did this learning together. But what's also increased is the time I take to behold them, the walks I take, listening to the wind in the trees, the time I spend with my kids just to play, and with my wife, just to see her. These simple moments have always been meaningful to me, but now I appreciate and hold on to that meaning with such an expansive sense of awe. Just to be, just to live, is a divine mission. And, of course, the meaning of what Torah is, that has expanded for me too. I love this book like no other. I love its ideas and its coyness, its structure and its wisdom. But now when I read its words, I sometimes read them out loud, appreciating the sound and wondering if maybe somewhere in there we can still hear the echo of God's primordial Ruach.
I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for spending the time going through this with me. This material is very special to me. I feel it's been so meaningful to me, really meaningful. I don't want to feel like I'm letting it go. So I want to thank you for doing it with me, and I want to thank you listeners out there for taking the time to make this a part of your lives too. And I hope it's been resonant with you and gives you some new ways of thinking that can enrich not just the doings of your life, but the beings of your life too.
I think I can speak for all of us when I say thank you, Rabbi Fohrman. And that's a wrap. Psst, guess what? There's more. In case you're not sick of us yet, there's an epilogue coming next week. We spent the last few weeks looking at how the tree returns in Torah text, but what about in our lives? When we feel far from Eden, how do we get back there? Rabbi Fohrman and I tackle these questions through a close reading of the source that inspired the one tree theory in the first place, Deuteronomy 30, otherwise known as Parshat HaTeshuvah, the passage on repentance. Come repent with us. I promise it will be fun. And keep an eye out for a whole new season of A Book Like No Other coming soon. Or don't keep an eye out. This is the 21st century. Just subscribe. Seriously, this is the moment to subscribe, so as soon as we're back, you'll know. And if you're excited for many more seasons of this podcast, please rate us. Write a review. Share with your friends. This series, like the Tree of Life, needs your love to grow. A Book Like No Other is a product of Aleph Beta, a nonprofit media company dedicated to helping people fall in love with Torah. If you like what you're listening to, I'm going to ask you if you can please consider joining the ranks of our paid members at alephbeta.org. Aleph Beta is a little bit of a weird nonprofit. We're almost entirely crowdfunded by people like you. So I just want to make this plea that if this Torah meant something to you, it's up to individuals like you who actually vote with their contributions, with their small donations to say, hey, I believe in this. I like what you're doing. Your contributions go towards teaching and spreading high-quality Torah to as many people as we possibly can. If that mission matters to you, and if you want to support it, it means the world to us. Thank you for partnering with us. in enabling us to do this really meaningful work. This episode was recorded by Rabbi David Fohrman and me, Imu Shalev. It was edited by Tikva Hecht with additional edits by Evan Weiner. Audio editing was done by Hilary Gutman. A Book Like No Other's senior editor is Tikva Hecht. Adina Blaustein keeps all the parts moving.